Welcome to this explainer. Over the next few minutes, we're going to dive into the gripping and honestly largely hidden history of the absolute backbone of the global economy. Okay, let's just jump right into this. Think about this for a second. In the year 2025 alone, the world bought roughly $3 trillion worth of oil, and almost all of that massive sum was paid for using exactly one currency. Now, you might think, well, obviously that's just because this particular currency was the strongest or maybe the most naturally stable. But the truth is actually far more fascinating than that. This global monopoly exists because of a highly strategic, secret deal made out in a Saudi desert way back in 1974. It created what is known as the Petrodollar. It is arguably the absolute most powerful financial system that you've never been taught about in school. But to truly understand how we got here and why this exact system is now facing its greatest threat in 50 years, we have to travel back to a moment of sheer, undeniable financial panic. Right, so picture this. It's August 15th, 1971. U.S. President Richard Nixon walks onto national television and delivers an absolute shockwave to the global system. He announces that he's suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. To really grasp why this was such a massive deal, we have to look at the setup right before this moment. Since the end of World War II, the global financial system operated under the Bretton Woods Agreement. This basically meant the U.S. dollar was firmly backed by physical gold. Any country holding dollars could literally knock on America's door, hand over those paper dollars, and get actual gold in return. That rock-solid guarantee made the dollar the most trusted currency on Earth. But there was a glaring problem. America had been printing far more dollars than it had gold to actually back them, largely to fund wars, social programs, and just immense Cold War spending. Other nations started looking at the math, realizing it wasn't adding up, and they started showing up at America's door, demanding their physical gold back. So Nixon panicked. He slammed the gold window completely shut. Almost overnight, the dollar was backed by absolutely nothing but trust. And at that specific moment in history, let me tell you, trust was in very short supply.
The early 1970s quickly descended into total economic chaos. After Nixon ended gold convertibility in '71, things just got significantly worse. Jump to October 1973. Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack on Israel, triggering the Yom Kippur War. When the United States responded by backing Israel with a massive airlift of military weapons, Arab oil producers, organized under OPEC, decided to hit America back with the most devastating weapon they had: oil. They drastically slashed their production and launched an oil embargo, directly targeting the United States.
The shock of that 1973 OPEC embargo was immediate, and it was brutal. The global price of oil absolutely exploded, jumping from about $3 a barrel to nearly $12 a barrel. The effects stateside were catastrophic. Gas stations literally ran dry. We're talking lines of cars stretching for blocks and blocks. Signs rating, "Sorry, no gas today," just became the standard operating procedure everywhere. So put yourself in America's shoes at this exact moment. You've got a currency that no longer has any gold behind it, inflation is getting incredibly ugly, and the world's absolute most important commodity is actively being weaponized against you. It was, to put it mildly, a very bad situation.
Section 2. Birth of the Petrodollar. A secret deal in the desert. America desperately needed a new plan. Actually, what they really needed was a new anchor for the dollar. If it wasn't going to be gold anymore, it had to be something else that every single country on Earth desperately needed. Something so utterly essential to modern civilization that the entire globe would have absolutely no choice but to keep holding and using US dollars to get it.
Enter Henry Kissinger, the U.S. Secretary of State. He travels over to Saudi Arabia with a highly strategic proposition for the Saudi king. The pitch essentially went kind of like this. Saudi Arabia was sitting on the largest pool of oil on Earth, obviously incredibly lucrative, but it also made them a massive, flashing target in a very volatile region. So Kissinger brokered this beautifully elegant solution. The deal was that Saudi Arabia would agree to sell its oil exclusively in US dollars, and then they take their extra leftover revenue and invest it straight back into US Treasury bonds. In return, the United States provides comprehensive military protection, sells them advanced weapons, and strictly guarantees the security of their oil fields. In 1974, Saudi Arabia said yes, and within a year, the rest of the smaller OPEC members followed suit. The implications of this were just staggering. It meant if any country, whether it was Japan, Germany, whoever, wanted to buy oil, they first had to go out and acquire US dollars.
This arrangement brilliantly built into an ingenious, self-sustaining loop. The real genius wasn't just pricing the oil in dollars, it was what happened to those dollars afterward. It's called petrodollar recycling. Step 1. Oil is priced in dollars, creating this constant, permanent global demand for U.S. currency. Step 2. Oil exporters suddenly find themselves sitting on actual mountains of dollars, way more than they could ever possibly spend domestically. So these excess dollars are recycled. They flow right back into American banks, financial markets, and U.S. Treasury bonds. Step 3. America uses this recycled money to fund itself. This constant influx of foreign capital helps finance government spending, it keeps the demand for U.S. debt sky high, keeps domestic interest rates significantly lower, and ultimately, it funds the very military that protects the oil fields, keeping the oil flowing and the cycle spinning. America essentially created a system where it didn't even need to sell the oil itself, it just needed the world to keep using dollars to buy it.
And this machine worked exceptionally well. By the 1980s, the whole system was in full swing. The dollar's share of global reserves had climbed over 70%. U.S. Treasury bonds became the world's undisputed favorite safe haven asset, and American financial markets became the gravitational center of all global capital. Because the whole world basically had to absorb dollars, America was granted this crazy ability to borrow cheaply, run huge deficits, and print money while effectively pushing much of its inflation onto everyone else. Economists actually coined a very polite phrase for this unbelievable financial advantage. They called it an exorbitant privilege.
Section 3. The ultimate financial weapon. The dollar as infrastructure. Because as we'll see, the dollar evolved from just being a convenient global money supply into something much, much more formidable. It transformed into the ultimate financial weapon. So the crucial point to understand here is that over the decades, the dollar system became synonymous with the global financial infrastructure itself. It literally became the grid. The vast majority of global trade, cross-border banking, reserve holding, and international debt payments all run through the dollar system. Because of this, the power of U.S. sanctions became utterly terrifying. Being sanctioned by the U.S. isn't just a matter of losing access to a single currency. It's like being completely kicked off the financial internet. If America decides it doesn't like what a country is doing, it can leverage this massive infrastructure to effectively make that nation's economy just stop working altogether.
So what actually happens when countries try to bypass this grid? Well, history shows a pretty complex pattern regarding nations that publicly challenge the dollar. In the year 2000, Iraq's Saddam Hussein announced oil would be sold in euros. 3 years later, Iraq was invaded, and oil sales reverted back to dollars. Over in Libya, Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency called the gold dinar, supposedly backed by roughly 143 tons of gold, to replace the dollar in African oil trades. In 2011, NATO intervened, Gaddafi was killed, and the plan entirely dissolved. In Venezuela, which, by the way, sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, Nicolas Maduro launched a crypto project in 2018 called the Petro to dodge sanctions. Though the crypto project failed, the U.S. heavily ramped up sanctions, blockaded tankers, and there was a subsequent military operation targeting Maduro's regime. Now let's pause here. We must be completely impartial and stress a major caveat from geopolitical analysts. None of these conflicts were caused solely by currency disputes. That's really important to note. They all involved a massive, complex mess of motives spanning weapons concerns, drug trafficking, regional politics, and humanitarian crises. But the historical pattern of severe consequences following dollar defiance definitely remains a notable observation.
Section 4. The system starts to crack. The cost of weaponization. Because look, for nearly half a century, nobody could really break the dollar's grip on the global economy. But empires and financial systems don't stay unchallenged forever, right? A monumental shift occurred recently, specifically in 2022, right after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In response to the invasion, the United States and its allies made a truly historic decision. They froze nearly $300 billion of Russia's foreign reserves and cut major Russian banks completely out of the SWIFT payment system. Now, SWIFT is the secure messaging network banks use to move money across borders, and Russia was cut off practically overnight. Decades of Russian national savings, parked in a system they had been assured was completely safe, instantly became unreachable. While this action undoubtedly severely impacted Russia, it also sent a massive, undeniable shockwave of fear across the rest of the globe. Every other government holding their national wealth in US dollars suddenly had this jarring realization: their money was only truly theirs for as long as the United States permitted them to have it.
And what's really interesting is how that sudden fear triggered a highly coordinated global reaction. We began to see this quiet but very deliberate move away from the dollar grid. Just look at the actions of these major global players. China dramatically accelerated dumping its U.S. treasuries, dropping its holdings from a peak of over $1.3 trillion down to roughly $600 billion. Russia and China rapidly transitioned more of their bilateral trade into yuan and rubles. Brazil and China struck brand new deals to settle their trade in their own local currencies. India actually began paying for portions of Russian oil using rupees. And perhaps most symbolically of all, Saudi Arabia, the exact same nation that helped birth the petrodollar system back in 1974, publicly announced it was now entirely open to settling trade in currencies other than the US dollar. That is a massive shift.
The numbers clearly tell the story of this transition. While the dollar absolutely remains incredibly powerful, its dominance has tangibly slipped over the last 2 decades. Back in 2001, the dollar made up a huge 72% of all global central bank reserves. Today, that number has fallen to under 58%. That is a significant erosion of the global safety net that the U.S. currency has historically enjoyed for so long. If we look at today's global reserve landscape, it clearly shows this fragmentation. Yes, the U.S. dollar is still taking the lion's share at 58%, but look over at the Chinese yuan. While it currently sits at roughly 2% of global reserves, which I know seems pretty small, it's super important to remember that just a decade ago, that number was essentially zero. It really highlights the slow, steady rise of organized alternatives creeping their way into the system.
And because there isn't yet a single, perfectly trusted fiat currency, government-issued paper money, to completely replace the dollar right now, central banks worldwide are actually looking backward to find a safe haven. They are so incredibly anxious to diversify away from US dollar risk that they have been hoarding physical gold at record, completely unprecedented levels. In the year 2024 alone, global central banks aggressively added over 1,000 tons of gold to their national reserves. Think about that volume. They are actively seeking assets that absolutely cannot be frozen by a foreign government.
Okay, to be entirely clear, we definitely need to maintain perspective here. The petrodollar machine is far from dead. It still very much runs the world. The dollar still dominates a staggering 88% of all foreign exchange transactions, and it's used for roughly half of all global trade invoicing. No single rival, not the yuan, not the euro, not gold, nor crypto, comes anywhere close to replacing it right now. But the dynamic has undeniably changed. For the first time in 50 years, the machine is facing real, coordinated competition. It isn't facing a sudden death by one giant challenger. Instead, it's facing a slow death by 1,000 cuts, as emerging markets increasingly work together to bypass the dollar grid entirely.
Which brings us to the most fascinating unknown of all. I really want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. As we've noted, in 2025, 1 in 4 cars sold globally is an electric vehicle. The entire world is actively working day and night to become less dependent on oil. So if the very commodity that props up this magnificent 50-year-old financial loop is no longer the absolute center of the global economy, what fuels the petrodollar machine next? It's a massive question, and it's one that will undoubtedly define the geopolitical power dynamics of the decades to come. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I invite you to keep questioning how the systems around us really work. See you next time.